Are you entirely sure that this will suffice to protect your identity? Brother Anders's distorted voice asked, through the heavy-duty breath filter he had fitted over his head, as he looked over at his unlikely allies, the skepticism that was probably on his face hidden well by the obscuring device. Underneath the covering of a blacked-out, canvas-like looking face mask, Eskvatara scoffed. "You think you're in any position to question me, choir boy?" The former Miet soldier replied with a hiss in his voice. Below the covering of his face, he was wearing the very military uniform he had worn on his body as he had to flee his home planet before he could become the scapegoat for a major political incident. Brother Anders, on the other hand, had never been a military man, yet he still wore the pitch black and star-dotted uniform of the UHSDF, or at least a more than convincingly made replication of one. Even despite the toughly made modified silk the uniform was woven out of, his muscular physique was still bleeding through the relatively tight jacket. Seeing him in that attire was uncanny, and not just a little uncomfortable, just like he was seeing all the other brothers and novices donning the same appearance, while their Miet allies slipped back into their former occupation's vesture. However, it was necessary for the task at hand, and therefore they would have to endure it for a bit. "Please," Alexander said, slowly stepping in between the two men with calmingly raised hands. "There is no need for quarrel. No one is questioning your skill, Eskvatara." Alexander was one of the few people in the room not dressed up like military personnel, confined to stay in the background and not take active part in the operation, as he accompanied his flock to guide them true during their dangerous task. And being in that position, he took a long moment to look over the Miet's uniform once again. With them being originals and not self-made replicas, they would have to be more careful with the attire of the felines. "And you are sure you all removed any identifying features?" he asked the man just to be safe, seeing as there were still a number of markings on the uniform, the purpose of which the guide did not know himself. "Aye," Eskvatara replied through a grimace, not quite as quick to seek a fight with the guide as he was to seek one with Brother Anders. Still, his remaining compatriots that had fled Dunama alongside him started to form up behind their former corporal. All of those that weren't left behind in hospitals back on Earth, to be treated for their conditions, that was. Alexander nodded. Just then, one of the few novices also not wearing any uniform walked up to him from the side. Uselessly, he leaned in towards Alexander's ear to whisper into it, seemingly forgetting that their feline allies would hear anything they said clear as day, no matter how quiet they would try to be. "Guide Page, the Saint and his procession have left their rooms and are heading towards an unknown destination in full gear," the novice whispered into his ear. Alexander lifted his eyebrows in mild surprise. They were venturing out in full gear? So far, there should be no reason for them to act that way, unless something unforeseen had happened. Had another unknown force made a move, and thus forced them to act? "All of them?" he asked the novice, not bothering to whisper himself. The novice cleared his throat and recoiled slightly in surprise at the raised volume. However, he still dutifully replied, "The Miet does not appear to be with them, and they left the other off-worlders behind as well, but wherever they are heading, they appear to be in quite the rush." "Fascinating," Alexander mumbled, but then turned to the two men he had been speaking to before. The situation had changed, and acting on it now with such little information on what was happening would be a foolish thing to do. "We shall delay our departure until we know what has driven Saint Olwyn to his actions, and then deliberate if we should proceed as planned." Brother Anders nodded in acceptance. However, Eskvatara stood up straighter in attention, his ears agitatedly twitching underneath the covering of his face. "Aldwyn's out in the open?" the feline asked, with clear disdain for the Saint in his voice as he spoke. "And he's hurrying somewhere? That means we could—" Alexander was not willing to let him finish his thought. "Even when they are seemingly inattentive, that is a fight we do not want." he informed the overenthusiastic feline with firm words. They may behave mildly at most times, but do not forget that these are more than deadly people we are dealing with. Engaging them in a head-on engagement without an incredibly clear advantage should not ever be our course of action. And besides, if the ambassador was attacked by human and Miat weaponry now, it would throw a major wrench into our plans. I don't care about your plans, the feline immediately hissed back at him, which caused Alexander to deeply exhale. No, he replied in a forced calmness, but you do care about your comrades getting the care that they need, which they won't if this entire operation comes crashing down, burning. Esfatara lowered his stance aggressively, and his tail began to move in angry sways. Still, despite that, Alexander approached the man slowly and rested a hand on his shoulder. I know you wish for that man to get his due punishment, but do not throw away everything you have worked for petty revenge. You escaped to a safe place. You have the time to get what you deserve in a way that will leave you and your comrades in a better place, not in a worse one, he assured him with genuine words, trying his best to look at where he expected the feline's eyes to be, under the sack over his head. Although he let out a disgruntled and definitely discontent snarl, Esquatara soon relaxed his stance slightly. He did not seem happy about the fact that Alexander had brought up his old friends. However, he still knew that the guide was right. Fine. We'll stick to your plan for now, the former soldier soon agreed, and wait for his people to disperse again for the time being, seeing no need for them to form up on him while they waited for things to play out. Alexander nodded, thankfully, before slowly turning and gradually walking over to the corner of the large stank room they had rented for themselves within the Nestandiot station, where they had built up a little bit of a communication hub for themselves. Small computer terminals placed on temporary tables constantly broadcasted the feed transmitted to them by their forward agents. So far, they were in no rush to act. They could stand back for longer if they had to, and therefore Alexander had an expression of mild curiosity on his face as he leaned in closer to one of the devices, wondering just what the saint was up to now. What the hell would drive her to visit that idiot alone at a time like this? Esvatara asked sometime later, as he stood next to Alexander and Brother Anders, watching the saint and his guards depart from the detention center that they seemed to have spontaneously visited in the middle of their night. Although Alexander could not see his face, he could imagine the disapprovingly confused expression of the feline, based on his tone alone. At least we now know why she wasn't with them. Love drives us to do odd things, Alexander mused, while he pushed himself up from the chair he had taken a seat on, as they observed the situation unfolding, or at least half of it. It had come as a bit of a surprise that the feline had seemingly managed to sneak out of the hive without either his own forward agents or her own company noticing. Love? Esvatara asked, in a slightly disbelieving tone, and turned his head to look at Alexander. Wasn't he her boss or something? Alexander exhaled slowly and shook his head. He didn't feel like playing all of this out with the rather volatile man next to him. Never mind, he said. But do you agree now that it was a good thing that we waited with our operation? The feline waved his head from side to side for a moment. Well, we don't know what they were talking about in there, but I guess maybe, he mumbled after a while, sounding quite unhappy about having to concede the point. I don't think anything she may have said could really strengthen her case, Alexander supposed aloud, really doubting that the Miat and the Cimareskis had a lovely, tearful reunion in there. Then he looked directly at the former corporal. Get your soldiers ready, you'll be moving out. Esquatara nodded underneath the bag still covering his head, before letting out a brief whistle as he began to walk over to the other side of the large room they had all converged in. Meanwhile, Alexander turned to move over towards Brother Anders, who was kneeling on the ground not too far from him, and checking the contents of some crates they had brought with them, for what must have been the 5th or 6th time by now. "And do you think you have everything you need?" Alexander asked, with a hint of humour at the man's obsessive checking. Brother Anders also chuckled slightly, although the laugh sounded wrong and unsettling through the breath filter's distortion. "We should have it all," he confirmed for the guide, and pushed himself up. Faced with him now, Alexander lifted his hand to flatly press it over the man's heart. "Best of luck, brother," he wished him at first, before slightly smirking and adding, "or as our allies would say, success to you." Brother Anders lifted his hand, and in a seemingly instinctual movement, he reached for the empty place before his sternum, where usually the symbol of his faith would be hanging from his neck. For this operation, he of course had to leave it behind. Still, he acted as if it was there, as he closed his hand around the imaginary star-framed cross. "Thank you, Guide Page," he replied honestly. "I will not disappoint." There was a certain strangeness about much older people of faith addressing you with such respect that Alexander had still not shaken ever since the moment he had become the church's new guide. However, he still appreciated the brother's honest words. "You will not," he confirmed for him, without a doubt, before stepping away to allow Anders to rouse the novices for the task ahead of them. As Anders moved away, Alexander briefly turned back to the screens he had just left, and with the imposter syndrome still hammering away at his heart, he wondered if the saint was plagued by similar thoughts. The man acted so sure about everything he did, but was he really? Time would tell, Alexander supposed, especially after today. "You really should have talked to us." Koko, or in this case more precisely Commander Koenig, admonished Shida as they walked back to the hive. After the first shock had been digested and everyone was sure that everyone else was alright, she had dragged Shida aside so she could start with her assessment of the situation, to declare a proper punishment later, leaving the rest of the team to trail somewhat behind them, while she chewed Shida out. "Visiting someone in jail is not a code violation, not even if they're technically the enemy, and you're not on a clock 24/7. Simply requesting a bit of time would have been much easier, much less stressful, much less dangerous, and you wouldn't have gotten yourself written up over it. You do realize that breaking the rules is a much worse look for yourself, if there was absolutely no reason to do it in the first place, right?" Swallowing, Shida exhaled slowly. "Yes, ma'am," she replied quietly and earnestly. "I am not arguing that it was a good idea in any sense of the word." "Then why did you do it?" Koko asked exasperatedly, and threw her braided ponytail to the side with a movement of her head. "I don't know, ma'am," Shida replied honestly. "I just felt like I had to." Koko sighed. "I get that," she replied, doing her best to sound compassionate, despite her duty-mandated anger at the feline. "But why didn't you just talk to us? Not even to James?" Shida really wanted to look down in shame, as she could give absolutely no answer that she was proud of. However, keeping her composure was part of the job as well, and she had no interest in making the situation even worse than it already was. Therefore, she kept up eye contact with the projected dots on Koko's breath filter, and kept her voice firm as she repeated, "I don't know, ma'am. I really don't." Koko looked at her intensely before sighing and crossing her arms. "This will certainly go into your file," she announced with her arms crossed. "This is your first violation, so I will be merciful for now. But although I can't give you any more substantial punishments while we're here, do not think you won't be running laps and scrubbing toilets once we get back onto any sort of base or ship. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Shida replied, without any objections. Koko nodded. However, she then added, "I am also assigning you 50 mandatory therapy hours to figure out what brought this on that can be extended to more at my discretion. A MEAT expert for those will be provided to you by the UHSDF at your request. You must schedule these hours yourself and will be obligated to have the scheduling, as well as your attending of the sessions, signed off by your doctor, as well as a superior officer. Also, You and I will have a long talk with each other once we're back at the hive. Understood? That one hit a little closer to home for Shida. Running laps and cleaning toilets was punishment for being dumb that anyone would get. But being told that you literally had to see a doctor to figure out what was wrong with you was a lot harder to swallow, especially when it came from someone she usually considered her friend. Of course, she knew that this was still just standard procedure among humans, but still, it didn't sit quite right with her to hear it. Still, she took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, ma'am." For now, she had to just accept it, although she was sure the major blockade for her would come soon enough, when she would actually have to sit down to book said appointments for herself. She also wondered if she should really call in a MIAT expert, or if trying with a human psychologist at first would be the more sensible option. With a random thought prodding at her, she looked at the commander hesitantly. "You're not going easy on me because we're friends, right?" Koko shook her head. "Nope, not because I screwed your boyfriend in the past either," she confirmed for Shida with a firm, but now a lot more relaxed voice, her dutiful anger now seemingly subsiding, as she had gotten out what she was paid for. "If I did, Sam would never let me live that down," she added, and briefly looked over her shoulder, back at the remaining humans that trailed them. "But even she agreed that this would be a fine course of action for now." Shida lifted her gaze to also look back, taking specific note of the blonde captain. Although they had spent a lot more time together technically, she was indeed a lot less close to her than she was to Koko. And Sam was more of a stickler for procedure anyway, so if she had agreed to this punishment, it was probably fine. Just as she had looked back, a shockwave suddenly slammed into Shida's ears, making her flinch and cower for a moment, as she covered her now ringing ears that felt like they had been painfully pushed in by the sudden onslaught of pressure. The humans also turned in surprise, although they were all much less affected by the event than Shida was, only seeming to momentarily flinch from the shockwave, in both surprise and mild pain, before immediately recovering and snapping around to its perceived source. Underneath their feet, the ground shook slightly, and in Shida's mind, the only thing she could think of at the time was an event back on the GES, on the day she had met Curie for the first time. "An explosion?" she could hear Abir ask, as her hearing slowly returned to her. "That's the direction we just came from," Tuya added onto his words, with nobody bothering to answer his questions. All around the same time, they all seemed to be realizing the same things. First of all, sounds and shockwaves carried far in an entirely enclosed system like a space station, so the fact that the shockwave was only as comparatively mild as it was, while whatever caused it had been strong enough to still shake the ground under their feet, while they were far enough to not be able to see what had happened, meant that it had to have been something big. "Well, we're not dead yet, so it couldn't have breached the hull," Koko expertly deduced next to Shida, and quickly grabbed the feline by the shoulder as she gently dragged her along in the quick jog to join back up with the rest of the team. With her ears still slightly ringing, Shida stared in the direction of the explosion. She didn't know she was imagining it, but she could have sworn that she heard gunfire? "You don't think that was..." she started. However, she didn't even finish before Andrej already replied, "At this point, I'm just going to assume the worst." Then the Major turned over to James. "What do we do?" James shook himself out of his first shock and looked around at everyone, asking, "What are you asking me for?" Due to being the one who was invited to this place, he had been calling the shots for a while now, but still, technically, he was the one being protected, and more than half of the people around him, including Shida herself, outranked him by a good margin. And technically, Andrej had been given the mission lead for this entire operation. "You want to go see if we can help, don't you?" Andrej asked him again, to which James lifted his hands defensively. "Yeah, but I'm not going to jeopardize all of us if..." he began to say. However, Sam hit his shoulder to make him shut up. "Don't make him say on tape that he's just looking for an excuse," the Major's right-hand woman admonished James in a harsh tone, and pointed to the cameras fastened to all of their chests, constantly recording them. James looked around again, and Shida did the same. Once again, the projections of vague emotions onto their masks made it hard to truly parse what everyone was thinking. However, it didn't seem like anyone was horrified, and only wanted to get out of there. Ultimately, it being the only one he could see clearly, James looked at Sheeta's face. But what was there really to say between them? It wasn't the first time they would charge head-on towards an explosion together. Their memory of Curie's laboratory, as well as their conversations with the lecture set about similar events taking place in the past, was still all over her mind. She nodded at James, and he nodded back. It would be a big diplomatic red flag if we didn't even try to help, he figured aloud, and it was clear to anyone with half a brain that he was mostly saying it for the camera. "Alright, everybody, time to move," Andres then quickly commanded, causing everyone to quickly stack up in an orderly fashion, rushing right back the way they came. Luckily, the stress and shock of the situation had been enough to completely wake all of them from their tiredness caused by interrupted sleep. As they hurried back the way they came with almost twice the speed they had moved at before, the twinkling light displays of the station constantly accompanying them under their feet, it didn't take long before they saw a wave of people coming towards them, vacating the area of the explosion in a large evacuation effort. This being a Deathworlder station, the variety was lower than it would have been in other places, and annoyingly, the vast majority of Laxoset populating this place had to use the very same walkway that the humans utilized, meaning they soon had to push their way through a tidal wave of Vulpines rushing towards them to get away from whatever had shaken the station. Off in the distance, a thick cloud of smoke could be seen rising up towards the station's ceiling, where it was quickly sucked away by powerful ventilation systems that seemed to luckily be undamaged from whatever had happened. Meanwhile, distant sirens could be heard blaring out, and waking everyone who hadn't been shaken into action by the explosion alone. "Let's move to one of the larger walkways," Andrej ordered everyone, with a hand raised, as they had reached one of the platforms connecting the different walkways to each other, in an effort to get away from the masses of people. Quickly, the entire group took the sharp turn together, rerouting their steps up a ramp that would bring them to a walkway created for giants instead of their own meager stature. As they ascended the slope, Admir stopped for a moment, as he looked out into the distance. "It really was the center," he mumbled, causing Sheeta to follow his gaze. However, without her enhancing goggles, her own eyesight didn't allow her to see anything at this distance, as she only saw a vague blur of distant buildings, with smoke emerging from somewhere. On the other hand, however, she could already hear far-off shouting underneath the blaring sirens, indicating that some efforts were already underway. As they had started to hurry this way, she heard the distant bangs of ringing gunshots. However, those had subsided after a short time. Now there was mostly shouting. After they had hurried onwards for a bit longer, Andres suddenly raised his hand once again, shortly before slowing down his steps, causing everyone else to do the same, as the troop gradually came to a halt. All of the humans stared off into the distance, and to her annoyance, Sheeta could once again only make out vague shapes, while all of her primate comrades seemed to be perfectly able to discuss details amongst each other. "Those are security," Sam was the first to inform everyone. "Do we trust that?" Admir posed as a question, while his hand rested on his weapon, but did not make any movement to draw it yet. "They have been competent so far," Tui mused, although that alone wasn't quite reason to relax just yet. "Keep a close eye on them. Long as they don't pull weapons on us, we'll see what they want," Andres decided for everyone, and slowly lowered his hand, causing everyone to slightly relax their stance. Although they were still more than cautious, as they slowly approached what was apparently a group of security blocking their way, even if Sheeta couldn't clearly see them much yet for herself. James moved up next to her and maneuvered her close to himself so he could provide aid in acting quickly, should things go south before she could really notice it. Though eventually, the Vulpines came into view for her as well as the group slowly approached them. Being the one walking ahead, Andres lifted his hands in a disengaging manner, while the Laxoset stared at them all with grim faces. "We're here to help," he announced, once he was within a range where it was reasonable to try and communicate. "What happened?" The Laxoset didn't answer right away. Instead, their heads turned as they looked at each other, and they seemed to quietly mumble something, which even Shida couldn't make out. Then again, it was probably in their own language anyway. Although their mumbling started quietly, some members of the forces seemed to get riled up after a bit, and soon they were outright snapping at each other, confirming for Shida that she did not understand what they were saying, even while she was able to hear it. Ultimately, a large red-furred man that seemed to be the superior of the bunch put his foot down with a loud command, causing all the others to shut up. Stepping forth, he approached the humans with his arms similarly raised. "I may get in trouble for this later, but I don't think you'll be dumb enough to charge back here if you were the ones responsible for all this," he announced loudly, as he gradually walked in the humans' direction. "But I'm still going to have to take you aside for questioning." "Why would we be responsible?" Andrej asked suspiciously, and Shida quietly agreed that the man's words hadn't sounded like a random, it-could-be-anyone sort of accusation. "Eyewitness accounts speak of human soldiers on the scene," the Lakshaseth responded professionally, and slightly lowered one of his hands to gesture sideways. "Please, step aside." With a slightly shocked and confused look at each other, the group complied with the instructions and slowly moved over, undergoing a brief interrogation of who they were, why they were here, and how people could be sure they weren't associated with the people responsible for the explosion. Luckily, the assurance that basically everything they did was being constantly recorded by their own body cams, and that they gladly allowed security to check the footage of their recent visit to the detention center, was quick to at least alleviate any suspicions that they were directly involved in the incident from them. Although technically, it did not prove that they were not associated. "Human military uniforms were clearly identified on the perpetrators," the Lakshaseth superior informed them, which caused everyone to look at each other in concern. "How was that possible?" "I need to call this in," Koko announced, and immediately stepped away from the group as their highest-ranking member. The sooner their higher-ups would know about this, the better. If it was true that human soldiers, or at the very least someone who looked like them, was involved in the attack, they would have to investigate quickly. Meanwhile, James stepped forth to approach the Vulpine. "Given the circumstances, I get that you don't trust us near the site itself," he explained compassionately. "But is there anything we can do to help?" Shida walked up to his side, if only to provide some sort of supporting presence. Meanwhile, the Lakshaseth looked unsurely at them. "I'm not sure if I should allow a foreign dignitary into a crisis area like this, Ambassador," he said, and scratched at the back of his head. "I may be an ambassador, but I'm also a first lieutenant of the military," James assured the man in return, "and I've come here of my own free will to help out. If you have no place for me, that's fine, but don't send me away on principle, please." The Lakshaseth sighed and looked around, clearly contemplating if he could afford to turn help away. "Well, you humans are strong," he humbled. "I guess we could use your help with the transport of some of the injured, who are more laborious to move." He raised his hand and waved one of his men over to their side. "Varquete will bring you to one of the temporary sick bays that the casualties were brought to before they can be transported to proper facilities." James nodded, and he didn't even have to say anything, as everyone was already forming up on him once again. Koko was still on the phone at this point, but still signaled that she was good to come along. Slightly slowed down by the still ongoing evacuation efforts that had masses of people walking in the other direction, in a thankfully ordered fashion all around them, they were then guided down to the ground level of the station, and towards a large area that was sectioned off by large tarps blocking the view of passers-by from the outside. "Were there many injured?" Shida asked, as they walked towards one of the large flimsy walls. "We don't have concrete numbers yet, and the debris is still being searched, but we suspect that there are dozens of casualties, both dead and alive," the Lakshaseth professionally replied, as he guided them along. Once they had reached one of the large tarps, he began to lift it out of the way, but stopped briefly to look back at them. "You're all fine with seeing dead bodies?" "We're soldiers," James replied for everyone, as he moved ahead to be the first on the inside. His team was close behind him, with Koko staying outside for a moment, as she was still on the phone, relaying what they knew so far to the higher-ups. Shida also stopped for a moment, because although she was also a soldier, and had been confronted with all kinds of things during her career, She admittedly had seen a lot less death than all of the humans surrounding her at the moment, meaning she felt it was better if she took a moment to prepare herself and get into the right mindset. Koko looked over at her with a compassionate and non-judgmental expression, giving her an encouraging nod. However, as she prepared herself, she could suddenly hear familiar voices on the inside, and what they said didn't sound good. "Fuck," Admin mumbled, his voice amplified by the mask. "This is bad," James soon agreed, and that was enough to shake Sheeta loose, and she also ducked under the tub to move inside. The wide area was entirely surrounded by the temporary white walls, and many smaller areas were sectioned off on the inside to give the injured individuals who were temporarily being treated here a modicum of privacy while they waited for transport. Medics and security officers were hurrying around all over the places to transport resources or provide aid where they could. Meanwhile, most of those who had not made it were laid down next to each other in a long row on the wall, positioned on the far side from Sheeta. There, she also saw James and the others stand with rather suppressed postures. The blood in Sheeta's veins froze as she saw the body they were all standing in front of. Large, bulky, and covered in sand-coloured fur. Her body moved on its own as she hurried towards them, and before she knew it, she had even inadvertently pushed Admir and Tuya aside as she burst forwards, needing to see what had seemingly happened to believe it. However, as she fell to her knees in front of the corpse without being able to keep herself from doing so, her mind suddenly screeched to a halt as she realized something. "It's not him," her voice mumbled without permission from her brain, as she stared down at the dead Cimareskis. For a moment there, she had been convinced that it was. "Representative Glorabal," James said, and nervously rubbed his mechanical hand along his neck. "This is going to cause issues." The man had clearly not died from an explosion. His fur was slightly dusty, but untouched by flame. His limbs weren't bent or broken, as if they had been crushed by debris or thrown around by a shockwave. He would have looked like he was just peacefully sleeping, had it not been for a single hole blown through the middle of his forehead. The back of his head was not visible, but judging by a dirty red puddle forming underneath him, the exit was likely not exactly pretty. She'd barely heard James speak as her gaze shot around, scanning across the other dead lined up in front of her. There were more Cimareskis, all in the same condition as the representative, killed by a single shot to the head. However, Captain Uton was not among them. Fighting herself to her feet, She'd turned and stumbled for a moment as she dashed through the sickbay, quickly running from sectioned-off area to area, or looking at each and every injured individual that was currently being treated here. Most of them were Lakshaset, but there was a good number of other species in the mix as well, most of whom had likely been incarcerated before the explosion. But still, Uton was not among them. "They broke him out," Sheeta uttered under her breath. She didn't know why she thought it. There were a million more possibilities. His body hadn't been dragged out yet, or it was buried under the rubble. Or maybe he had been injured but was already transported away. But she didn't believe any of those. No. She just knew it. Or at least her brain thoroughly believed that she did. For a moment she swayed in place, as her mind just didn't know how to deal with the information it was presented with. However, before she could truly lose her balance, James was at her side and held onto her to support her. Not really able to pay attention to him, She'd looked over at the row of dead bodies. So many, she thought, her mind still convinced that there was only one possibility for what had happened here. So many for him? Suddenly, another thought came to her, and leaving James standing there confusedly, she dashed over to the corpses once again, her eyes feverishly searching for a large set of antlers. But to her great relief, she didn't find those either, which gave her enough peace of mind for a second that she could try to somewhat calm herself with a long exhale. Still, this only further enforced her conviction of what had occurred here. But why would human soldiers... "Sheeta," A weak voice suddenly called out to her, causing not only her but also her colleagues who had begun to converge around her to turn around in surprise. As she turned, she looked back directly into one of the privacy areas, where a small body was laid out on a field bed. The white surface of the cot was covered in light red stains all over, and two attending medics standing next to it quickly hurried over to keep whoever had been laid down there from moving so they wouldn't injure themselves. Slowly, She'd moved over to the person that had, for some reason, called her name. The small figure was covered in cooling, gel-infused bandages almost all over, with some singed fur sticking out only in the area around the joints, and around one shoulder that the medic seemingly had to leave open so they could work on stabilizing the attached arm. The limb was covered in dark red, and in places blackened burns that leaked a clear liquid, and made the destroyed limb shimmer in the artificial light of the station. Its elbow was held in place by a brace, and had clearly been bent in an unnatural direction before being corrected, as it still looked twisted and broken despite the support. Further down the body, the thick fur around the usually bushy tail of a Lakshasat had been almost entirely singed off, leaving only a stubby and blistered mess of a stub behind, which had to be fixated in place so it wouldn't rub itself raw through stressful swaying. Moving in even closer, Sheeta could now see the injured person's face, or at least whatever of it wasn't covered. Most of it was wrapped up in the same bandages, although even through the covering wrapping, Sheeta could see that half of one of the Volping's large ears was missing. Her eyes were completely covered, with red seeping through the bandages where the green orbs would usually have been visible. Further down, the nose and most of the mouth were uncovered, although the blisters of burns were also visible on those. "Sheeta?" the person repeated, the blistered skin of her lips moving and stretching in painful-looking ways as she talked. And although it sounded croaky and damaged, Sheeta recognized the voice this time. "Caffrey," Sheeta replied, confirming for the injured woman that it was indeed her. "What happened?" With slightly shaky steps, she moved completely up to the woman's side. She didn't know her well, of course. Hell, she didn't even know her real name. They were barely brief acquaintances, if they could even be called that. Still, seeing that poor woman lie here in this condition, so shortly after she had seen her going about her normal day full of life and enthusiasm, it shook Sheeta deeply. "You're okay. I'm glad they weren't your people," the injured woman briefly muttered, despite her own pain, shooting a dagger straight through Sheeta's heart. She hesitated for a moment to reply something, simply not knowing what to say. For someone who barely knew her to worry about her well-being, despite being injured so gravely. However, then, she didn't have the option anymore, because just moments later, Caffrey's head sagged down, any sign of awareness disappearing from her body. Immediately, the medic sprang into action, checking her vitals with quick and professional movements, while prepping to possibly resuscitate her. However, after holding a hand up to a bandage-free part under her arm, one of the medics exhaled in relaxation. "She just lost consciousness," he announced. "Prep her for transport quickly, she needs to be scanned." He and his colleague began to transform his words into deeds as they sped up the process of treating the worst of the woman's injuries, so she would be ready to be transported to a proper hospital. Meanwhile, as Sheeta stared at her motionless body in a state of mild delirium, with her ears ringing and limbs not following her demands, she felt James once again take hold of her. He said something, but the ringing in her ears was too loud for her to hear. However, her mouth still moved on its own, as she reached out to return James's hug automatically. "I'm going to kill him,"